Okay.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Grief and Ambiguous Loss, presented by Home Instead and hosted by the American Society on Aging. We will begin shortly, but before we do, a few housekeeping notes. I would like to direct you to the left side of your screen where you will see 5 tabs labeled Speaker Bio, Important Information on Group Viewing, CE application here, FAQ/troubleshoot, and event resources. The slides for today's presentation are available for download under the tab labeled Event Resources. You will find information on how to obtain CE credits for this event under the CE application here tab, including links to the application and to the step-by-step CE guidance webpage. Please review before submitting an application. Please be aware that your time is logged and you must view the entire hour-long webinar to be eligible for CE credit and access the application. You will be able to access the CE application a minimum of 2 hours after viewing the event once attendance is received and recorded, although it may take up to 24 hours, so we appreciate your patience. If you are not logged into the webinar directly using the email address you registered with, then you will not be eligible for CE credit as we have no way of tracking your online attendance. If you registered before the live webinar, you will also receive a follow-up email by the end of the business day that will direct you on how to claim CEs and include links to today's slides and recording. You have 60 days from the live event date to complete a continuing education application. If you have any questions during today's presentation regarding the webinar, you can send those to us at any time using the Ask a Question box, and we will do our best to get to those questions in the last few minutes of today's programming. And now I would like to welcome our presenters. Dr. Lakeland Eichenberger is a gerontologist and caregiver advocate at Home Instead. She educates professionals in aging, families, and communities on the unique challenges that older adults face and the resources available to help them thrive. And Jenny Monroe, gerontologist and response team manager for Home Instead's global headquarters, leading the Home Instead response team in helping family caregivers navigate the complexities of the senior care continuum. We are so excited to have you both here with us today.
Thank you, Victoria. Hello,
Thank you,
everyone.
Victoria.
This is Lakeland, and I'm so excited to be joined by my colleague, Jenny. Today, we are talking about a topic that, isn't always, rainbows and sunshine. We're talking about grief and loss, and it can be a really hard topic to discuss. But I think it's really important because we all go through grief and loss throughout our lifetime, and we all tend to deal with it in different ways. A lot of times we talk about grief in the context of death, but people can grieve in other ways, such as the loss of independence or grief during a major life transition. And then there's this specific kind of unique form of grief called ambiguous loss, and that's loss without closure. And so we're going to dive specifically into that type of loss today. A lot of times, ambiguous loss, we see that occur in those caring for someone living with Alzheimer's or another type of dementia, where they feel like they're watching the person kind of maybe mentally or emotionally fade away, but their body's still physically present. And so we're going to dive deeper again into that topic in just a bit. But as professionals, I think it's important for us to be aware of the different types of grief and how it might impact the older adults that we serve, the family caregivers, care partners that we serve, and then maybe, understanding it can also help us personally, whether we go through a loss or one of our friend or family members go through a loss. So, again, so excited that you have joined us today, even though this is a bit of a tough topic. I'm really glad to have Jenny joining with me to also share her personal and professional experience. So let's just take a look quickly at the objectives of what we're hoping to cover today, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jenny to kick us off. So, pardon me, I have a little bit of a tickle in my throat today, so please bear with me. So we're going to start by talking about the different types of grief. And then we're going to talk about the concept of ambiguous loss and really dive deeper into that. And then talk about how people cope and learn different strategies. Coping and mourning and grief, it looks different from one person to the next. And so how can we be supportive of that as professionals in this field. And then we're going to end by resources that can help individuals, families through this process. So that is what Jenny and I hope to cover. And now I'll pass it to Jenny to kick us off on the various types of grief.
Yes, thank you, Lakeland, and thanks, Victoria. Hello, everybody. I'm really honored to be here today. I will start off with our type of losses here. First, we have a type of loss of death, and there's also a loss of non-death. And we're going to start with the death losses. And I'm sure all of us have experienced one or more of these type of death losses. Important relationships, such as a partner or spouse, adult children or grandchildren, other family members, could be siblings, could be cousins, it could even be grandparents for that matter, or close friends. I recently, in the last couple years, have lost both my mother and my brother-in-law. So I've experienced both kinds, and we'll talk about those types of deaths also later on in our discussion. And then there's also types of death. They can either be very sudden as well as traumatic, or it could be a slow decline in death. Some of the non-death losses that came up to both Lakeland and I, our first one is a retirement or job loss. Some of us, when it's time to retire, I have a personal friend who retired not too long ago and really had to adjust to her life and realize that she, had to find a new purpose in her life. Her first 6 months of retirement were fantastic. She went vacationing, she visited grandchildren, and then after that high period of 6 months, she found she really had a loss in her life and needed to find a new purpose. Not too much time after that, she did find another job and became unretired and found a new purpose and reason to get up in the morning and get dressed and get out. So her loss of retirement definitely was something she wasn't expecting and she didn't have a plan for. Another type of non-death loss is divorce. You can feel all kinds of feelings in a divorce, and I too have experienced that and had feelings of anger, disbelief, sadness, loss, being overwhelmed and shocked. All those type of feelings do come with divorce. They can come in different stages, different times, but those are all true feelings that we definitely can experience during a time of divorce. Another type is loss of independence. Some people having a home care brought into their home for a loved one or for a parent. Sometimes a parent rejects that type of home care or bringing somebody in to help them because they do feel that that's a first sign of their loss of independence, that they need help. Another example would be moving to a care facility. Um, I speak to family members every day here at Home Instead where they're looking for care for their parents. They prefer to bring somebody in the home so mom and dad will have more independence living in their home. But sometimes that's not always the case, and they do have to move into a care facility because maybe they do need 24/7, round the clock type of care. So an individual really can feel a loss of independence when that time might come into their lives. Another type of loss of independence is leaving, or if an individual or an older adult stops driving. If they lose that independence of driving, they may feel a sense of loss and sadness. Also, moving from home or relocation, moving from a neighborhood, a city, a state, or relocation for a job. Those are all types of losses that a person has to deal with. And then even grandparents, grandparent caregivers, a loss of that grandparent role. Usually, a grandparent's life journey often can take an unplanned detour when a grandparent has to become a parent to a grandchild. And that can occur due to a premature death of a child's parent, a child, the occurrence of mental health or substance abuse concerns, where that grandparent now has to fill in as the parent, and they really lose that role that they anticipated to spend with their grandchild. So these are all just a list of non-death losses that all the feelings are real and it is an emotional loss. Types of grief too. There's quite a few different types of grief that we're going to cover. The five that we have listed here are chronic grief, traumatic grief, absent grief, disenfranchised grief, and anticipatory grief. Chronic grief really is a type of grief that really doesn't get better over time. You can also refer to it as prolonged grief and complicated grief. A person that really cannot get over this type of grief should really consider professional help from a professional grief counselor. Um, this without treatment, their suffering can eventually become depression or lead to self-harming thoughts or substance abuse. So chronic grief is real and definitely needs to be treated if you experience this. Traumatic grief is a form of grief that happens in response to a sudden and unexpected loss. Feelings of disbelief, being overwhelmed, anger, mistrust, and disenchantment of others. There can also be feelings of guilt and fear are often common after a traumatic event. Not too long ago, as I mentioned a couple years ago, I have a brother-in-law who was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer in July, and he passed away 3 months later. And my sister really not only suffered from chronic grief, but also traumatic grief. And you can combine types of grief. And that was an example of her grief. Just really, it all happened so unexpected. It was quick. She had those feelings of anger. She had feelings that she just could not get past. And so, yes, sometimes grief will need professional help, and she had to get that. So, and that's okay because she realized it and recognized it and sought help. So. Another type of grief, absent grief, is a form of complicated grief where you don't feel the normal pain and sadness associated with suffering. An example of absent grief, again, would be a death that's sudden and the person is still in shock or denial. There's different stages and emotions of that grief where a person can feel angry. They can be in denial, like this isn't happening to me. And, he was here one day and now he's gone. It may never manifest with absent grief as well. And one might suppress their emotions that they ordinarily have after suffering a loss. Um, those stages, one would say that these are the 5 stages of loss, whether it is through a death or a non-death, like divorce. Those feelings can exist. Disenfranchised grief is when grieving individuals do not receive the social support and degree of sympathy from others that they need to process their grief. Some examples of this is through a miscarriage, and I personally have gone through 2 miscarriages, and I definitely can understand this type of grief because the griever really can feel rejected or may feel they can't publicly express their grief and they have to take it on to themselves. So other examples of this type of grief could be death of a pet. Pets are our family and they become our family. And when we lose those, some people might feel like, oh, I can't share that, or they don't want to really show their emotions because they don't feel like, well, it's not a family member, a person, but that pet was, with the family for years. Another type of this grief would be even death by suicide, death by overdose, or grieving someone that has disappeared and grieving a loved one with dementia or Alzheimer's. And this too, many of us have loved ones that have dementia and Alzheimer's. And so this can definitely probably become frequent with people that have loved ones that live with dementia or Alzheimer's. And then anticipatory grief is a type of grief is coming. So a diagnosis of a terminal illness or a loved one or a friend that's moving far away. You may not feel like you have control of them moving or the let's say, the diagnosis of their terminal illness. And this type of grief definitely could be one that you keep inside you because if it is a terminal illness, you can be with that person, but you have no control of the end, which would be could be the end of their death or the end of their life. Or again, if someone's moving far away, it's coming, and this can present some anxiety inside. But it is a type of grief that you do need to talk about and share with that person in order to move forward. And with that, Lakeland, I am going to hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Jenny,
You're
for
welcome.
sharing all of those different types of grief. And as you mentioned, it can come in so many different forms. Grief can, and you can have multiple kinds of grief that you're experiencing. And so I think it's important for us to talk about grief and talk about mourning. And sometimes the terminology around this kind of gets interchanged, and there's some school of thought that grief and mourning are kind of two different things, and so it's, I think, important to put some context around this. So we talk about grief. Grief is more passive. It's something that we feel when we lose something or lose someone, whereas mourning is more active. It's things that we actively engage in to mourn that loss. And again, there's no right or wrong way to grieve. There's no one way to grieve. Everyone's experience is unique. And I think what's really important is there is no timeline for grief. I think it's really unfortunate, in the United States, we get, X number of days, maybe 5 days of bereavement leave from our jobs, and we're expected to do all of our mourning and experience all of our grief in those 5 days and return back to work feeling completely, over that loss. And that's just not realistic. It's not practical. We should not expect people to be able to grieve in a matter of days or weeks or months, or even for some years. I'll share a little bit more. I listened into a grief panel during one of my courses during my graduate studies, and there's people on this grief panel who experienced all different types of loss, and they all agreed that grief never truly goes away. You never stop kind of grieving or mourning the loss of a person in your life, especially if they were very close and significant to you. It just kind of changes and morphs over time. So you might have experienced that yourself. You might be witnessing this in those that you work with or in a family member of this grief versus mourning. But let's talk a little bit more about kind of the differences. So Jenny mentioned earlier kind of the stages of grief that people typically go through. Again, everyone's experience is different, but we do see kind of patterns in grief. And according to Kubler-Ross and colleagues, very well known, the 5 stages of grief. You have denial, denying that the person is lost, or maybe if it's a different type of non-death loss, kind of denying that it's happening, maybe denying that retirement has happened, or denying that your friend is going to move, that sort of thing. Then we also see anger occur, and this is normal. And again, somebody might go through these stages not necessarily in this order. So they might experience anger first and then denial second. It really, again, is very personal. But when a person becomes angry, it might be that they're angry that the individual has passed away. They might be, if they believe in a higher power, it's very common to be angry at God, mad at God, to have those types of feelings. Maybe they're mad at themselves. They're kind of thinking through things that they've done in their past. Or maybe they're mad at the person that passed away. I have a family member who after the death of their father was very mad and angry at their father because he did not live a healthy lifestyle. He did not make preparations for, who would take over the family business, and left it all on my family member's plate. And so he was very mad at his dad after he passed away, asking a lot of why questions. And that's natural and normal to have those questions. And, and I think it's healthy to express those forms of anger in healthy ways, of course. I know we'll get to that in a little bit, some healthy ways to express the various feelings and emotions that we go through during this grieving and mourning process. And, again, those kind of life events or transitions, those non-death losses, you might be, if you're going through divorce, you might be mad or upset with your ex. Retirement, or if you get laid off, you might be mad at the employer. So again, these types of feelings of anger can be common. Bargaining is another stage of grief that someone might go through. Again, when you're mad, you start to bargain with yourself, start to bargain with your higher power. If you believe in a higher power, you start to ask those what if questions, or start to say, woulda, coulda, shoulda, those kinds of statements like, if I would have done this, then maybe they wouldn't have passed away, or if I wouldn't have done this, maybe we wouldn't have gotten divorced. And so you start to bargain or start to make bargains with yourself. If I can just move through this grief, things will get better, that sort of thing. And then some people do experience depression. That's that sadness and longing that's associated with loss. And this can be very intense for some folks, and it can also come in waves. So, you might, even months into kind of your grieving and mourning, go through a stage of depression where you don't feel like getting out of bed, you don't feel like eating, you don't feel like going to work. And so, again, it might not happen for some, and it might happen for others periodically over time. And then usually at some point there's that acceptance phase where over time the pain starts to ease and it's more possible to accept what has happened. We might not ever get over the loss. I don't think we should ever be expected to fully get over that, but we can learn to kind of adjust the way that we live, adjust to the new normal without that person, or adjust to that new loss of independence and kind of find our new normal. And so those can be the stages of grief. Again, they don't occur in any specific order. Some might last longer than others. And a person might not, again, experience all of those stages. But something that's interesting is these tasks of mourning that can help us through the grieving process. And these are things that we more actively engage in as opposed to kind of passively experience. So some of these active tasks of mourning are to accept the reality of the loss. And this is both intellectual and emotional. Intellectually coming to terms with that person, okay, is no longer with us. I can't pick up the phone and call them anymore. I can't run over to their house and pick their brain on something. So kind of accepting that intellectually, but also kind of from an emotional standpoint, accepting the reality of the loss. And also processing the pain of grief. And this often takes a lot of courage because it's hard. It's hard to face pain. As humans, we naturally want to avoid pain. Some of us want to avoid conflict, but it's important if we're actively engaging in this task of mourning to address that pain head on and to not push our feelings down, to find those healthy outlets to express those feelings and, how to adjust to our new normal, especially adjusting to that new normal and kind of finding what life is like without that individual. And that's kind of that next task of mourning, is that adjusting to the world without the person who passed away. And this can be challenging. I think a lot about the older adults that Jenny and I interact with. There might be a spousal couple, and one of the individuals, the one that passed away, they probably managed the household finances or did all the cooking and the housework. And now that person's no longer there. And so that's one, significant kind of part of their life that they're going to have to find a new normal. And sometimes that's when they call Home Instead to bring us in to maybe help with some of those tasks around the house, to help during that period of adjusting to the new normal. But really, you have to kind of figure out on a day-to-day basis, like, how do I move forward without this person? And then the last kind of task of mourning is finding an enduring connection with the deceased in midst of embarking on a new life. And what that really means is, acknowledging they're not physically present, but that kind of notion of, I know they're not here, but they're with me in my heart, or they're my guardian angel watching over me. Mm-hmm. Finding ways to kind of make that connection, that ongoing connection. And you might also pair that with rituals of, memorializing the anniversary of their death, or still continuing to celebrate their birthday, or recognizing the wedding anniversary and looking at old photos and finding a way to still remain connected to that individual while at the same time moving forward, finding what new normal is like. So I mentioned that we're going to dive a little deeper into ambiguous loss as a type of grief, because that's one we see commonly amongst, as Jenny mentioned, amongst individuals that are caring for a loved one with Alzheimer's and other types of dementia. Jenny and I, we've helped facilitate support groups over time, and this is a theme that comes up a lot. It's a type of grief that's really unique, and a lot of times people, they don't know how to describe it. They're feeling this loss. They don't have a name for it, but Pauline Boss, she is a researcher that did give a name to this, and it's a term called ambiguous loss, and it's loss that is unclear, has no resolution, and no closure. And it's really a way to express losses that are both absent and present, and it kind of breaks down into two different types. And so if I haven't lost you, hopefully this will help make it a little more clear. So there are those types of losses where the person is physically absent, but there's no closure. So this might be when the body is physically missing. For example, it could be a soldier missing in action, a child who has run away or been abducted, or a loved one whose body was never recovered after an accident. So again, the body's not physically present, but there was no closure around that. So that's kind of the physically absent component of ambiguous loss. But the one we see most commonly, at least in the work I do and the work that Jenny does, is that emotionally absent type of ambiguous loss. When the body is physically present, but psychologically there is a change or an absence. So again, a person's living with Alzheimer's disease or another type of dementia, and they're experiencing changes in the brain that's taking away their ability to function in daily life, taking away the memories. And it's really, really hard for family members to watch their loved one slowly kind of slip away, as I've heard it described. Someone also, you might be experiencing this with a traumatic brain injury where they maybe have a change in personality. So you might also see this when a person is really going through types of addiction, and there's a lot of change in their personality and behavior. So again, that emotional absence is really what I tend to see most frequently. And so I want to talk about, what impact does this have on an individual? Maybe it's a caregiver, a care partner, a family member. And it's really, there's this ambiguity coupled with the loss that can create a barrier to coping and grieving. Because again, it's confusing. It's providing this feeling of unsettledness, some anxiety, some strain, because you're conflicted. You're feeling like, okay, this person is physically here, but I'm sad because what I'm witnessing isn't true to who I've known them to be. And so it's really more, it's more than loss and grief. It's also impacting the relationship to that person. I've always been the daughter, and now I'm having to be more of the parent and be more of the caregiver to this individual. And this can impact family relationships too. Families who have siblings all kind of pitching in to care for the person that's experiencing these changes. It might impact those sibling dynamics, the relationship, the family unit as a whole is experiencing kind of this loss and grief, and everyone's experiencing it differently. And it could cause a person to feel immobilized. They're not sure what to do, what direction to go, how to cope, how to feel. they often feel very alone in this type of grief. And Jenny, I would be curious, just for a little insight from you, because I know you've experienced this. We've talked about
Yes. And as you were talking about becoming the caregiver for your parent, I thought of really, I lost my role as the daughter of my mother, and my role had really changed from daughter to caregiver. So my mother lived with
it.
Alzheimer's for 13 years. And so I never really thought about it until you just brought that up, Lakeland. Like, my loss was the loss of a role in my life.
Mm-hmm.
Was always her daughter up until her diagnosis of Alzheimer's. And as her disease progressed throughout the years, my role really changed as her caregiver. And yes, it was a loss, and it definitely caused confusions and anxiety. But I learned how to change that role, and and the time I had spent with her. But yes, living with someone and caring for someone with dementia or Alzheimer's, that they're present, but mentally they weren't. We couldn't have the conversations we used to have. She didn't know my name. She didn't know when my birthday was. And so it was a different type of engagement that I had to have with her. But a lot of managing mixed emotions of being sad, not so much on my part angry, but just sad that the disease had taken over her, but happy she was still physically there. But overall, yes, the role of being her daughter changed to being more of her caregiver until our family finally did provide a professional caregiver to come into the home and do those things that we did. Then I could become her daughter once again. So
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Jenny, for sharing that. And that leads really quite beautifully. We didn't plan this, I swear.
No, I know. I was like,
into kind of the next set of slides on, how can we cope with these losses? Because Jenny, as you mentioned, you're kind of living in this kind of in between space of, okay, I'm still a daughter, but I'm her caregiver. I'm conflicted because I don't want to watch her suffer, but I'm glad she's still here physically. And those are some things that I'm going to go over here in just a moment. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So now we're going to move into kind of how to cope with grief. And I'm going to start with how to cope with ambiguous loss, and then we'll open it up kind of to a broader discussion about coping with grief in general. But again, it can be helpful for those who are experiencing this ambiguous loss to have a name for it, to know you're not alone. You're not the only one going through it. And if you can kind of learn about it, it can kind of help us live better in this kind of area of uncertainty. It can change the lens of how we see the person that we're caring for. And again, it helps you realize, okay, I'm not alone. I'm not the only one having these kind of weird, conflicting feelings. There are others that are going through this at the same time. And really, as Jenny mentioned, there's this kind of paradoxical thinking that can take place. And it's kind of this thinking of two opposing truths they're happening at the same time. And it's instead of, living in this world of either or, we shift instead into an if and type of thinking. So, recognizing it's okay to have these conflicting thoughts of, my mother is both gone, kind of mentally, but she's also still here. So it's okay to kind of live in those two truths. Or, I really wish this was over for my loved one, but at the same time, I really want my loved one to keep living because I care deeply. And so these kind of opposing truths, this paradoxical thinking, help us kind of normalize, again, what we're feeling. And then also, it's important to find meaning in the experience. I often hear caregivers talk about, how caregiving or being a care partner is really, really hard. And it's fundamentally changed the caregiver's life. And often they reflect on how it's changed them. And a lot of times there's a lot of positive changes that come out of that. So that can sometimes be helpful in coping. You're reflecting on, what have you gained from this experience? And it's okay to have, again, that paradoxical kind of thinking here, where you could say something like, due to my caregiving experience, I've lost Maybe it's that special mother-daughter relationship with my mother, but I've also gained some really beautiful moments where my mom has told me stories that she remembers from childhood that I've never heard before. So it's those kinds of reframings can help a person cope with this ambiguous loss or kind of normalize it. And it's also important to recognize and internalize that you're not going to be perfect as a caregiver. You're not going to get it right every time. No one is perfect. And so caregivers should also not hold themselves to that unachievable standard. We need to accept, good enough, it's good enough. It's not possible to be perfect. We need to prioritize what's important and also give ourselves grace because we are grieving as we are caregiving. And so, again, readjusting some expectations. And Pauline Boss actually wrote a book called Loving Someone Who Has Dementia. And she lays out 7 guidelines on how to kind of cope with this ambiguous loss. And we've kind of touched on some of these already, but I wanted to share this because it could be very helpful to pass along to those that we work with. Or maybe, it's helpful for us ourselves if we're caring for someone living with Alzheimer's and other dementias. A great book to kind of pass along as a reading recommendation. But her 7 guidelines start out with finding meaning. We just talked about that. And sometimes, the meaning that you find in your caregiving journey might change moment to moment. You might really just focus on, okay, what is providing me meaning today? Maybe it's that you had one good interaction with your loved one, maybe a little glimpse back to the person that you knew them as. And that might provide you the hope that you need to kind of just get through this really tough day. In that really tough moment. So finding meaning is important. And also balancing control with acceptance. Again, back to that notion of no one is perfect, and caregiving is not something we're able to master. No one is the perfect caregiver. No one has mastered caregiving. If there was somebody that had mastered it, we would have a how-to guide for caregiving that is universal and used by everyone. I wish that exists, but no one caregiver does it all perfectly, and every caregiving situation is different. So it's important to focus on, okay, what can I control within my caregiving situation? And then balance that control with acceptance. Accept I can't control the fact that my mother has dementia, and I can't control the fact that she says really hurtful things from time to time because that's the aging brain disease. That's not my mom. I have to accept that. But what I can control is my reaction to those hurtful sayings. I can try not to let it, get to me. I can try to, just smile and try to change the subject to something happier. So again, focusing on what you can control. Also broaden your identity or revive your identity to fit the ambiguity of the situation. So Jenny talked about this a little bit. She kind of had to adjust her expectation. I know I'm her daughter, but I feel more like a parent. Or, if it's a spousal situation, I know I'm his wife, but I feel more like a caregiver. And just coming to kind of terms with the fact that the role has changed, and then seeking out resources that could maybe help you get back to a little bit of that role. Like Jenny mentioned, they brought in professional care, home care, hospice, to help the family take over some of those tasks so that they could spend that quality time again with the person that they were caring for. And so, again, kind of recalibrating your identity as it fits within the situation can be helpful. Also, managing those mixed emotions. Caregiving and this journey of ambiguous loss, it's a roller coaster of emotions. And again, it's okay to have those two kind of opposing emotions at the same time. I feel guilty because I don't want them here anymore, because I don't want to see them suffer, but I also feel sadness because I don't want them to pass away. You would have those opposing emotions, those complex emotions all at the same time, but it's really important to find healthy outlets for those emotions so that it helps you to cope. We'll get to some of those strategies here in just a moment. Next is the concept of holding on but also letting go. Again, adjusting your expectations within the relationship, and then kind of acknowledging, okay, well, my spouse no longer provides kind of that emotional spousal support that they once did. So who in my life can I lean on for maybe that emotional support? Maybe it's a really good friend, or maybe it's a sibling. Again, adjusting the expectations, but also making sure that you're also getting some kind of support and nourishment and encouragement along your journey. And then number 6 is it's important to imagine new hopes and dreams. What can you do for yourself as the caregiver now into the future? Can you create a personal goal while you're providing care? I know that can feel almost impossible sometimes in the moment, but we know, especially when it comes to Alzheimer's and other types of dementia, it's a progressive disease. That person will pass away because of the disease. There's no cure. And so your caregiving journey will come to an end someday. And have you thought about what your life will look like after caregiving? It's really hard to think about that. But it also can maybe help inform some of the decisions that you're making now. You might decide, okay, I am going to focus on my own health because I want to be sure that my health after caregiving is okay. So I'm going to prioritize my doctor's appointments just as much as I prioritize the doctor appointments for my loved ones. So again, kind of thinking about the future, that hope can really help get through some of those really tough times. And then take time to take care of yourself, mind yourself, as Pauline Boss says. And I know self-care, I talk about it a lot. Sometimes I feel like caregivers probably roll their eyes because they say, easier said than done. But somebody recently said it should not be called self-care, it should be called survival care. Because again, often the person you're caring for relies so heavily on you that what if something were to happen to you? Have you let yourself think about that? Who would care for that person? You need to care for yourself so you can continue to be there for the person you're caring for, and then take care of yourself because, again, that journey of caregiving will come to an end someday. And so it is important to take time for that. I'll call it survival care as we wrap up these 7 guidelines. So now let's talk a little bit about coping with grief in kind of a more general sense. I've talked about this already, but grief really does vary person by person. Even within the same family, if a parent passes away, one sibling might deal with it very differently from another. And so we should never have expectations for what grief should look like, how a person should cope. We should never have that end date for somebody's grieving process. And I mentioned that panel that I listened into a little earlier, all those different people that had gone through all different types of grief. And one of the panelists said on that panel, and this has always stuck with me, grief does not completely go away, but it gets lighter with time. And so we need to allow people time to cope with grief, to engage in mourning, and again, not to hold anyone to an unrealistic standard. So let's talk about some ways that we can cope with grief, some things that we see to be helpful. First, understanding how you go about your own coping mechanisms. Maybe you default to yoga or reading or organizing. I know for me, I had recently, it was a non-death loss, and my default is, okay, I need to do something that I can control, and so I default to organizing. So recently, I experienced a non-death loss, and I organized the entire garage. I cleared it out, dusted, mopped, wiped down every surface, put it all back. It felt so good. It gave me time to process the loss and then to take the next steps of kind of grieving the loss. And so everyone, again, is going to be different. We all have our own coping mechanisms, and some are healthier than others. And if you know that you typically default to an unhealthy coping mechanism, something to really be aware of and to seek help maybe earlier in the grieving process. So for instance, if you default to substance abuse to cope, that would be a good thing to seek support on. And then journaling. I do love to journal. I think that for me personally, it helps to write out all those emotions that I'm feeling. And so some find that to be helpful. For others, joining a support group and talking with others that are going through a similar situation can be so helpful. We see this to be really helpful in the context of Alzheimer's and dementia caregiving, but a lot of times there are grief support groups. There's one called Grief Share I have a resource slide at the end where I include the information on that. And it's a support group of those who have lost loved ones. I also know a lot of hospice companies, a lot of funeral homes, they host support groups and they have resources for those that are grieving and mourning. So those are important to tap into. If you are a person of faith or you're a spiritual person, leaning into spirituality, prayer, meditation can be helpful. Also, connecting with your clergy or chaplain or spiritual advisor can be helpful in processing the grief. Also, participating in rituals. I've mentioned that term a few times. Again, if you are a person of faith, there's a lot of faith traditions that have rituals specific to death and grief and mourning. If you think about the Jewish culture, there's the ritual of sitting Shiva and the ritual of burying the individual within, I think it's the first 24 or 48 hours. And so every culture kind of has their own death rituals. But also things like planning and participating in funeral or memorial services can be a ritual that can help with the grieving process. Sometimes, especially during COVID, a lot of us who maybe lost a loved one never got that ritual of an in-person funeral or memorial service. And so that was really hard for a lot of people in that grieving process. I know, I think back to my mom. She lost her brother when he was in his 30s. And when we were kids, she would drive to his gravesite and just sit there for a few moments and tell us kids, occupy yourselves in the back, but she would just cry. And for her, the ritual of going to his gravesite and crying helped her through the grieving process. And so it might look different for everyone, but those rituals can be important. And it can also be, I mentioned this earlier, memorializing, the death anniversary, maybe that person's birthday, maybe honoring them at family get-togethers, setting an extra place setting or lighting a candle to honor them, or sharing a funny memory about them, looking at pictures of them. Again, these are rituals that can help us through the grieving process. And then, of course, therapy and counseling can be really helpful, both for individuals and sometimes for families, depending on the situation. For those that maybe experienced a traumatic death, having a family counseling session could potentially be helpful. But as I was, researching for today, I came across an interesting study that found that oftentimes most individuals, they do cope with just the support of family and friends. And so I just wanted to share one graphic with you from this study. It was a population-based survey of bereavement risk and the support needed in the context of complicated grief. And this visual, it shows the researchers, they predicted a percentage that would fall into each of these risk categories. So they had high, moderate, and low risk. And so in parentheses, you can see the numbers on the right-hand side. Those were their predictions of how many people would fall into these categories. And then the ones on the left, the numbers on the left are the actual numbers from this survey. And they found that well over half fell into that low-risk category. So you can see 58.4% often deal with grief through the support of family and friends. And so then they looked at those that fall into the category of moderate risk for complicated grief, and found about 1/3, or 35.4%, were needing additional support of peer groups, support groups in their grieving process. And then a small percentage were at higher risk for complicated grief and needed referral to a mental health professional at just about 6.4%. So if you think about the general population, most are coping with their grief just with the support of family and friends. So I think for us as professionals, it's important for us to realize that most people are, going through it with just kind of those levels of support. And so it's important, if we see the need for a referral to maybe a support group, or need a referral to a mental health professional, to a grief counselor, that we're extending those resources to help folks. Because again, this was a survey, so this is kind of self-report. So I'm guessing that maybe, and this is just my hypothesis now, I'm not speaking for the study, that maybe more people could have benefited from referrals to those support groups or to mental health professionals, but perhaps just didn't have the resources at their fingertips. And so, again, it's really important for us to be extending those resources. And we're going to be getting to some final tips now for grieving caregivers and for professionals, and then those resources. So, Jenny, I'll let you touch on the tips for caregivers since you're pretty close to this work.
Absolutely. And I know we're running out of time, so I'll just cover really the four that I found was very helpful for me. And the first I want to say is just to always accept your feelings. We're all going to go through ups and downs of emotions. Something that came to my mind was just driving in my car and feeling okay one minute and, rocking out to a tune in the car. And then the next song that came on, I would just start crying and thinking of my mom, and it, just brought up a lot of memories. So I just want you to know that it's important to accept your feelings and know there's going to be highs and lows, and those are okay and they are normal. Some of these tips, I think they're all great to help you grieve, are fantastic examples. Some of the things that I have done and has helped me is just really reaching out to my own family and my loved ones to talk about my feelings and get support and share memories together. And fortunately, I have 8 siblings to do that with, so I can pick whoever I want to call up on the phone and just share with them, oh my gosh, I was in my car and I was doing fine. And then this song came up and I just started bawling. I had to pull over, and them telling me that's okay. I've had that too. And it happens to me too. And knowing that I'm okay and those feelings are real. And also not to be afraid to ask for help, whether it is calling up a sibling or a really good friend and asking them, to listen to you for a while and share your feelings and emotions. With my sister who lost her husband and my sister-in-law when my brother passed away, both of those individuals joined a support group, and they found that was very helpful because sometimes talking to strangers who are experiencing the same thing you are might be easier for some people, and for them it was because they had that commonality of they joined a group of women who had lost their spouse, and they continued to be part of that support group or have built a new friend out of that support group that they can share their feelings with. Another tip for grieving caregivers for me was to exercise. I know Lakeland, you put down the yogas and the meditation, and that's great too. I mean, just going out for a walk by myself was a release. And I felt it was a win-win because not only was I getting some exercise in, but it just really, I felt like I could think about my mom or even my brother that passed away while on a walk or a run. I just felt like my brother and I ran a lot together. And so when I would run, I felt like I could talk to him during that time. Sometimes I would smile when I thought of a happy memory or time that we had together. Sometimes I would stop and walk, and sometimes I would cry during that walk. So just having that outlet and finding out, what works for you, what works best for you, and having an outlet to go-to person to share your feelings and experiences with are important. So I know we're running out of time and we have questions, so I'm going to end there and give it back to you, Lakeland. Excuse me.
Thank you, Jenny. And we just have tips for professionals. Of course, we want to offer that support and be available. I think it's important also to listen and try not to give our own advice because that could be dismissive, like, oh, I lost a loved one, I know what you're feeling. Because again, we're all grieving in different ways, so we might very well know what they're feeling, but we also might not. So that's important. Allow the person to express their bitterness or anger. Allow them to feel that pain, but also be kind and patient and understanding. I think that goes a really long way. Some additional tips here. Don't force them to share their feelings, especially if they're not ready. And in some professional situations, it is appropriate to offer a hug or to hold their hand. Not always, but sometimes that physical show of support can be helpful when it's appropriate. And also to continue to be there for them when others go back to their routines. I hear this a lot from grieving individuals. I had a lot of support at the beginning, and then about a month or two in, everyone else went back to their lives, and I was still grieving. So I think as professionals, we can continue to check in with the people that we work with to make sure, even months down the road or at that 1-year anniversary, check in and say, hey, I know today is a tough day because that 1-year anniversary. How are you doing? What can I do to help and support? And be aware of those signs of depression and offer those referrals to mental health professionals when they're needed. And then finally, we do have this resource slide here. I encourage you to download those. I mentioned hospice companies often offer bereavement services after the person passed away. Same with funeral homes, so don't be afraid to tap into those. The Hospice Foundation has a great website. Also, especially for those with that anticipatory grief, that ambiguous loss, helping kind of plan for the loss can be comforting in a way. And so the 5 wishes helps people kind of think through end-of-life wishes and decisions, so that can be helpful. I also mentioned that Grief Share support group. You can go to griefshare.org to find locations in your area that offer that type of bereavement support. Also, I think it's important for us as professionals to have resources for substance abuse and mental health services. So there is the National Helpline where you can call. Also, if they're, again, people of faith, encouraging them to tap into their faith communities. And also, if an individual is working, they might have benefits through their employer's EAP program, Employee Assistance Program, such as counseling that they could tap into. So that's one to encourage them to utilize. I know, Jenny and I, our organization, we get 5, I think, free mental health sessions, counseling sessions per year. And so tapping into those types of things can be helpful. I also did an entire hour-long session on ambiguous loss, and I've linked to it on the resource slide. And then I put some of these book recommendations. So, The Loving Someone with Dementia by Pauline Boss, The Heart of Grief by Thomas Attic, The Other Side of Sadness by George Bonanno, and then Option B by Sheryl Sandberg and Adam Grant. Those are all great books that you could potentially pass along and provide as resources. So again, want to thank you all for listening. I know we just have a few moments for questions, so I'm going to kind of comb through some of the questions that we're getting in and see what kind of answers. I know that somebody had mentioned pets, the loss of pets, and Jenny did cover that, how sometimes pets are like family, and so sometimes there's some complex emotions when you lose a pet because it does feel like losing a family member. So thank you for bringing that up. And somebody commented they work for hospice, and a lot of patients want to forego the funeral, and she encourages them gently to engage in some sort of celebration of life and some ritual of the loss. And I would agree with that. So thank you for sharing that. There's a lot of great questions that are coming in, so I apologize we won't be able to get to all of them. Let's see here. Do you have any recommendations for gaining more professional experiencing or training in grief counseling? I think that's a great question. I think it kind of depends on your profession. So, a lot of great continuing education courses kind of like this exist out there for the various professions. But if you, for instance, are a social worker, I would maybe look to your national association to see if maybe there's any certificates or kind of courses that you could go through on grief and bereavement. I think one of my favorite classes that I took in my graduate studies was a course called Death, Dying, and Grieving. Mm-hmm. And that's where that death panel came. I think, Jenny, did you take that class as well?
I did. I loved it. Yep.
It was so good. It was really, really good.
Mm-hmm. It was.
And somebody had asked, if we wanted to do a panel on grief, how would you kind of go about that? What questions would you ask? And I'll just share maybe a little context of the panel. I mean, we had somebody who had lost a spouse. We had somebody that lost a child with disabilities. In that child was in their 20s. We also had someone who lost her daughter in childbirth. So the grandchild is still very much a part of her life, but lost the daughter. And I believe that there was somebody whose spouse had a terminal illness. And so it was varying types of grief and varying situations. And so I think just, and all of these individuals had been at least a year out into their grief journey. I think that's important if you want to put together a panel, is to be just mindful on where these individuals are in their grief journeys. But it can be really, really powerful. And maybe that is a good thought as I think about, future webinars that we do is if maybe we do a panel on grief, because that would be insightful and interesting. But I think that that's all the time we have. I'll pull up here. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to myself or to Jenny. We're just really grateful that you have joined us. And I think just as a final thought, I'm going to say that quote again because I love it, that grief never goes away, but gets lighter with time. So I just appreciate all of you who are here willing to learn more about grief so that we can best support those in our lives and those that we work with professionally as they go through that journey. So, Victoria, I'll hand it back to you, and thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you so much, Lakeland and Jenny, and thank you, Home Instead, for bringing this webinar to our audience. Please be sure to check out upcoming webinars, including spousal caregiving, which is coming to us on August 2nd. As a reminder, please review the step-by-step CE guide before submitting an application. It will take a minimum of 2 hours for the attendance data to sync, although it can take a little longer. If you have any questions about the webinar, please feel free to email asa@info@asaging.org. And you do have 60 days to claim your CEs. Again, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Lakeland and Jenny, and thank you, Home Instead. And we hope you will all join us again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.